Power doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to make a mistake. The morning air at Arlington National Cemetery felt heavier than usual, thick with silence, respect, and something unspoken lingering between rows of white headstones stretching across the rolling green hills like an ocean frozen in time. A soft wind carried the distant echo of a bugle as mourners dressed in black stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes lowered, hands folded, honoring a fallen soldier whose coffin rested beneath a perfectly folded American flag. Every movement measured, every breath restrained, because this was sacred ground where dignity was supposed to be equal. But not everyone saw it that way. Standing near the outer edge of the gathering was Officer Daniel Hayes. His uniform crisp, posture rigid, eyes scanning the crowd not with empathy, but with suspicion, the kind that had been shaped over years of unchecked assumptions. And then there was the man he noticed, a black man standing quietly just beyond the front row, dressed in a simple dark suit, no medals on display, no insignia, just stillness, his gaze fixed on the casket. His face calm, but carrying a weight that didn't need explanation. His name was Marcus Whitaker, but no one around him seemed to know that. And perhaps that was the problem. Because in a place meant for honor, anonymity became a reason for doubt. Hayes narrowed his eyes, watching how Marcus stood, how he didn't shift or speak or look around like the others. Something about that composure unsettled him, or maybe it challenged something deeper he didn't want to confront. The ceremony continued. The flag was carefully lifted, folded with precision, each motion deliberate and practiced, handed to a grieving family member whose hands trembled as they received it, and still Marcus didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't announce himself. He simply stood there as if he belonged in a way that didn't need permission, and that was when Hayes made his decision. One step forward, then another, boots pressing softly against the gravel path, his voice low but edged with authority as he approached. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." The words hung in the air, subtle but sharp, drawing a few glances from nearby mourners. Marcus slowly turned his head, meeting Hayes' gaze with eyes that didn't carry fear or defiance, just quiet certainty. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he replied, calm, steady, almost gentle, but to Hayes, it sounded like resistance, like defiance wrapped in politeness. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the crowd, not in the ceremony, but inside Hayes himself, because he wasn't just hearing a man speak, he was seeing a line being drawn, and instead of questioning himself, he chose to challenge it. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past the flag, the trees, the silence, as if the world itself paused, waiting to see what would happen next. And somewhere between that stillness and the weight of unspoken truth, a single decision was about to change everything. The moment did not explode all at once. It tightened slowly, like a breath held too long. Officer Hayes took another step closer, his presence now impossible to ignore. A few heads turned, whispers barely forming before dissolving back into silence. This was not how a funeral was supposed to feel. Not here, not under a sky that had witnessed generations laid to rest with honor. Hayes studied Marcus more carefully now, searching for something that justified what he already believed. But Marcus did not give him anything. No nervous glance, no defensive posture, just that same stillness, the kind that came from knowing exactly who you were even when no one else did. "I asked you to step back," Hayes repeated, his voice firmer this time, carrying across the small space between them. Marcus did not move, not even an inch. His eyes shifted briefly toward the flag, then back to Hayes. "And I told you, I am where I need to be," he said quietly, not challenging, not pleading, just stating a truth that did not need permission. For a second, it felt like the entire ceremony tilted, like the world narrowed down to two men standing on opposite sides of something neither could fully see. Hayes felt the weight of eyes now, subtle but real. People were watching, not openly, but enough. And that changed things, because to Hayes, authority was not just about being right. It was about being seen as right. His jaw tightened, his hand resting near his belt, not reaching, just close enough to signal control. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing together. The bugle had stopped, leaving a silence that felt louder than any noise. Marcus noticed it too. The pause, the attention, the shift in energy, and still, he remained composed, There was no anger in his expression, no urgency, just a quiet patience, as if he had seen moments like this before and already knew how they ended. Hayes interpreted that calm differently. To him it felt like defiance, like a refusal to acknowledge the authority standing in front of him, and that was something he had never learned to tolerate. "Sir, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be," Hayes said. His tone now edged with something sharper, something less controlled, a warning disguised as instruction. Marcus exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but as if grounding himself in the moment. His voice when he spoke was steady, almost reflective. "Sometimes what feels difficult is just unfamiliar," he said, and for a brief second, those words landed somewhere deeper than Hayes expected. But instead of pausing, instead of questioning, Hayes leaned further into his certainty, because questioning meant doubt, and doubt was not something he allowed himself. The air between them grew heavier, thicker, as if even the space around them understood that something irreversible was approaching, a single decision, a single action that would not just interrupt a funeral, but redefine everything that came after. And in that fragile, suspended moment, neither man raised his voice, neither man stepped back. But the line between authority and truth had never been more dangerously close to. Breaking the stillness did not hold. It cracked, not with a sound but with a shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. Officer Hayes moved his hand slightly higher. No sudden motion, no dramatic gesture, just enough to signal escalation, and that was all it took for the air to change. A few mourners straightened, others exchanged quiet glances. The ceremony had not resumed. The silence now carried tension instead of peace. Marcus noticed every detail, the tightening shoulders, the shallow breaths, the way attention gathered like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. And yet his posture did not change. He did not raise his voice, did not step forward or back. He simply stood there, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Hayes misread that stillness again. To him it felt like resistance that needed to be controlled, managed, corrected, because in his world, authority was never questioned. It was enforced. "Last warning," Hayes said, his tone low but carrying a weight that rippled through the quiet. A phrase designed to end conversations, not continue them. Marcus held his gaze, not with challenge, but with clarity, as if he understood exactly what was happening even if Hayes did not. "You should think carefully about what happens next," Marcus replied, his voice calm, almost measured, the kind of calm that did not come from confidence alone but from experience. From having seen situations unfold beyond the surface, Hayes felt something flicker in that moment. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, brief and unwelcome. And instead of listening to it, he pushed against it, because doubt threatened everything he believed about control, about order, about who belonged and who did not. His stance stiffened, his presence expanded as if trying to reclaim the space that now felt unstable. Somewhere behind them, a uniformed figure began moving quickly through the rows, not running, but urgent enough to be noticed. A ripple followed, subtle but spreading, like a message traveling faster than words. Marcus caught the movement in his peripheral vision, but he did not turn. He did not need to. He already knew what was coming. Hayes did not. His focus locked forward, his attention narrowed to the man in front of him, to the moment he believed he still controlled. The wind shifted once more, brushing against the flag, lifting it slightly before letting it settle again, a reminder of where they were, of what this place stood for, and how far the moment had drifted from it. The approaching figure drew closer, boots firm against the ground, presence unmistakable now. And just before the silence could break on its own, a voice cut through it, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. "Officer Hayes, stand down." The words did not echo. They landed, heavy and final. Hayes froze, not from obedience, but from surprise, the kind that interrupts certainty. And in that single pause, the balance shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because what Hayes thought was a confrontation was about to become something else entirely, something he had not prepared for, something he could not control. And for the first time since he stepped forward, the moment was no longer his. The command did not just interrupt the moment, it rewrote it. Officer Hayes turned sharply toward the voice, his certainty faltering for the first time as A senior military officer stepped forward, his uniform marked with rank that spoke louder than any words. His presence alone shifted the air. Conversations that had not even begun suddenly ended before they could form. Stand down, now. The officer repeated, slower this time, each word deliberate, leaving no space for interpretation. Hayes hesitated, just for a second. But in that second, everything became visible, the eyes on him, the weight of the setting, the line he had crossed without. Realizing it, his hand lowered, not out of choice, but out of realization that the situation was no longer his to control. Marcus remained still, his gaze steady, not triumphant, not angry, just present, as if this outcome had never been in question. The senior officer stepped closer, his eyes moving briefly from Hayes to Marcus. And in that glance there was recognition, respect, something unspoken yet undeniable. General Whitaker, he said, his tone shifting, no longer commanding but acknowledging. And that single phrase moved through the crowd like a quiet shockwave. People who had been unsure now understood. Whispers did not rise, they disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence that carried a different meaning. Hayes blinked, the name settling in slowly, not because he did not hear it, but because he could not immediately process what it meant. The man he had confronted, questioned, tried to remove, was not an outsider, not someone out of place, but someone whose presence defined the very space they stood in. Marcus inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of authority, but of acknowledgement, calm and controlled, the same way he had been from the beginning. The difference now was not in him. It was in how everyone else saw him. Hayes felt the shift all at once, the weight of it pressing down, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, a realization forming piece by piece. Every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, every step he had taken now, carried a meaning he had not intended but could no longer ignore. I did not know, Hayes said, the words coming out quieter than expected, stripped of the edge they once had. But Marcus did not respond immediately. He looked past Hayes, toward the casket, toward the flag, toward the reason they were all there in the first place. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unchanged. You did not need to know who I was, he said, and those words landed deeper than any accusation could have, because they were not about rank or title. They were about something else entirely, something Hayes had overlooked from the start. The senior officer stepped between them slightly, not as a barrier, but as a transition, guiding the moment back toward what it should have been, the ceremony, the respect, the purpose. But the shift could not be undone, not completely, because something had already been revealed, not just about Marcus, but about Hayes, about the choices he made when faced with the unknown. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying the faint sound of the bugle as it resumed, the ceremony continuing as if nothing had happened, but everyone knew it had. And as Hayes stepped back, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, one truth became impossible to escape. The moment he thought he was enforcing order was the moment he lost control of everything that followed. The ceremony resumed, but it did not feel the same. The bugle's notes floated through the air with a haunting precision, each tone meant to honor sacrifice, yet now carrying the weight of something unresolved, something that had quietly shifted beneath the surface. Officer Hayes stepped back into position, but his stance no longer held the same certainty. His shoulders were still squared, his uniform still sharp, yet something invisible had cracked, something that could not be pressed or ironed back into place around him. The mourners returned their attention to the ceremony, but not completely. There were glances now, subtle, restrained, the kind people try to hide but cannot fully suppress, and Hayes felt them, even when he did not look. Marcus Whitaker remained where he had always been, near the front now, no longer mistaken for an outsider, but not seeking recognition either. His focus returned to the casket, to the flag, to the life being honored, as if nothing else deserved his attention. And that contrast spoke louder than any confrontation ever could, because where Hayes had been consumed by control, Marcus remained anchored in purpose. The final honors were carried out with careful precision, the folded flag presented, the silence observed, and through it all, Marcus stood as he had from the beginning, composed, present, unwavering. But Hayes could not return to that same stillness. His mind replayed the moment again and again, each detail sharper than before. The words he had chosen, the assumptions he had made, the tone he had carried into a place that demanded humility, and now, standing there, he could feel the distance between who he believed he was and what his actions had revealed. The ceremony concluded with quiet dispersal. People moved slowly, respectfully, some approaching the family, others leaving in silence. But the space around Hayes remained slightly open, not avoided, not confronted, just subtly different, as if the air itself held memory, a reminder that something had happened that could not be undone. Marcus began to walk away, not rushed, not delayed, just a steady movement forward. And for a brief moment, Hayes considered saying something, anything that might close the gap that had formed, but the words never came. Because he understood now that some moments do not offer immediate resolution. They simply exist, waiting for consequences to unfold. In their own time, a senior officer approached Hayes quietly, his expression neutral but firm. "We will need to review what happened today," he said, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual, and that tone carried more weight than anger ever could. Hayes nodded, a small motion, but one that acknowledged a reality he could no longer avoid. This was not over, not even close, because what had taken place in those few minutes was no longer contained within the boundaries of a funeral. It had already begun to move beyond it, into reports, into conversations, into records that would not fade with time. And as Hayes stood there, watching the last of the mourners disappear beyond the rows of white stones, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. The moment he had tried to define someone else's place had now begun to redefine his own, and there was no stepping back from that 3 days later. The silence of the cemetery had been replaced by something colder, more clinical, the kind of silence that lived inside offices, reports, and recorded statements. Officer Daniel Hayes sat in a small internal review room, the fluorescent lights above casting a pale, unforgiving glow across the table. There were no flags here, no ceremonies, no music to soften the weight of what had happened. Only a folder placed directly in front of him, thick enough to suggest that the moment he thought was brief had already grown into something far larger. Across from him sat 2 investigators, their expressions neutral, their posture composed, not hostile, not sympathetic, just focused, the kind of presence that did not react but observed. "Walk us through your actions at the cemetery," one of them said, his voice even, steady. Hayes nodded slowly, his hands resting on the table, fingers interlocked as if holding something together that was already slipping. He began to speak, carefully at first, choosing words that felt familiar, words he had used before to explain decisions, to justify instincts. But as he continued, something felt different, because this time the moment did not belong to him alone. It had been seen, recorded, remembered by others, and now those perspectives existed alongside his own, shaping a version of events he could not fully control. "What made you believe the individual did not belong?" the second investigator asked, and the question lingered longer than expected, not because it was complicated, but because it was precise. It reached beyond actions and into reasoning. Hayes hesitated, just briefly, before answering. He was standing outside the designated area. He was not engaging with others, and he did not present any visible identification. The words sounded structured, professional, but even as he spoke them, they felt thinner than they had before. The first investigator nodded slightly, then opened the folder, revealing still images, printed from video footage, each one capturing a different angle, a different moment. Marcus standing calmly, the ceremony unfolding, Hayes approaching, the interaction frozen in time from multiple perspectives. "Did he behave in a threatening manner?" the investigator asked. And this time the silence that followed was heavier, because Hayes knew the answer, and he knew that answer mattered. "No," he said quietly, the words settling into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. The investigators exchanged a brief glance, not judgmental, not surprised, just acknowledging the progression of facts. "So your assessment was based on perception rather than behavior," the second investigator said, not as an accusation, but as a clarification, and in that moment, Hayes felt something shift again, not outside, but within himself, because the structure he had relied on, the certainty he had carried, was now being examined piece by piece, and each piece revealed something he had not fully considered before. The room remained still, the lights unchanged, the table unmoving. But the narrative was no longer fixed. It was being rewritten in real time, not through emotion, not through confrontation, but through truth. And as Hayes sat there, facing the quiet, steady questions that did not need to raise their voice to be heard, one realization became impossible to avoid. The moment at the cemetery had not ended when the ceremony did. It had only just begun. And the consequences were now unfolding in a way that no badge, no rank, no assumption could shield him from. The room did not change, but the weight inside it did. What had started as a routine review was no longer just about procedure. It had become something deeper, something that reached into patterns, decisions, and the quiet assumptions that shaped them. Officer Hayes sat still as the investigators continued. Their questions no longer focused on what happened alone, but on why it happened the way it did. "Let us go back to the moment before you approached him," one investigator said, sliding another document across the table, a transcript of witness statements, each line capturing a perspective Hayes had not considered in real time. Multiple attendees described the individual as calm, respectful, and consistent with the tone of the ceremony. "Did you observe anything different?" Hayes looked at the page, scanning the words, each sentence reinforcing a version of Marcus that stood in contrast to the one he had constructed in his mind. "No," he admitted, his voice quieter now, not defensive, not resistant, just factual. And that shift mattered, because for the first time, Hayes was no longer trying to control the narrative. He was beginning to see it. The second investigator leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with intent. "Then help us understand the decision point. What made that moment different for you?" Hayes exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief second before returning to the table. "He stood out," he said, the words simple, almost insufficient. "In what way?" the investigator asked, not accepting the surface, not rejecting it either, just pressing gently toward clarity. Hayes hesitated again, but this time the pause was longer, because the answer was not something he could frame professionally without confronting what it truly meant. "He did not look like he belonged," he said finally, and the room grew still in a different way, not tense, not reactive, but aware. Because that sentence carried more than just explanation, it carried implication. The investigators did not interrupt, did not challenge immediately. They allowed the weight of that statement to exist on its own, to settle, to be heard fully before moving forward. "And what defines belonging in that space?" the first investigator asked, his tone unchanged, but the question precise enough to cut through any remaining distance. Hayes opened his mouth, then stopped, because for the first time, he did not have an immediate answer, not one that felt complete, not one that could hold up under the quiet scrutiny of the room. His mind moved through the scene again, the flag, the mourners, the silence, and Marcus standing there, composed, present, exactly as he had been from the beginning. Nothing about that image suggested disruption, nothing about it justified the escalation that followed, and yet, in that moment, Hayes had acted as if it did. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as if the truth had always been there, but required stillness to be seen. The second investigator closed the folder gently, not as a conclusion, but as a pause. "This process is not about a single moment," he said. "It is about understanding the pattern behind it." And those words shifted everything again, because now the focus was no longer just on what Hayes did, but on what had shaped him to do it. The room remained quiet, the lights steady, the table unchanged. But Hayes felt something else settle into place, something that could not be undone, because what had been exposed was not just an error in judgment. It was a deeper reflection of how he saw the world, and for the first time, he could not look away from it. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because the truth had closed in. What had once been a simple explanation had unfolded into something far more complex, something that could not be reduced to a single decision or a single moment. Officer Hayes sat with his hands still resting on the table, but they no longer felt steady. They felt exposed, as if everything he had relied on to define himself was now being quietly examined from every angle. The investigators did not rush. They did not press with force. Instead, they allowed the silence to do its work, because in that silence, clarity had a way of rising on its own. "There is one more thing," the first investigator said, opening a smaller folder, thinner, but no less significant. Inside were internal records, prior complaints, notes that had once been filed and set aside, moments that seemed isolated at the time, but now formed a pattern when viewed together. Hayes recognized some of them immediately, not because they had stood out before, but because they had not. They had been dismissed, explained away, categorized as minor misunderstandings, but now, placed side by side, they told a different story, one that did not rely on a single event, but on repetition, on consistency, on a perspective that had quietly shaped his actions over time. These incidents were reviewed individually, the second investigator said, his tone even. But context changes when patterns emerge. Hayes did not respond right away. His eyes moved across the pages, each line a reminder of moments he had not questioned deeply, moments where his decisions had felt justified in the moment, but now appeared incomplete when viewed through a wider lens. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer neutral. It carried the weight of accumulation, of realization, of something that could no longer be separated into isolated parts. "This is not about assigning intent," the first investigator continued. "It is about understanding impact." And that distinction mattered because it shifted the focus away from what Hayes believed about himself and toward what his actions had created for others. Hayes leaned back slightly, not in defiance, not in retreat, but in recognition, because for the first time, the narrative was no longer something he could reshape with explanation alone. It had structure now, evidence, perspective, and consistency, and all of it pointed in the same direction. The second investigator closed the folder carefully, the sound soft but final. "The review board will make a determination based on these findings," he said, not as a threat, not as a conclusion, but as the next step in a process that had already begun moving beyond the room. Hayes nodded slowly, the motion almost automatic. But behind it was a growing awareness that what he was facing was not just an evaluation of a single action. It was a reflection of how he had chosen to see people, situations, and authority itself. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above. The table remained unchanged. The investigators gathered their materials with quiet efficiency, but Hayes did not move right away. He sat there for a moment longer, not because he had something left to say, but because he was beginning to understand that some moments do not end when the conversation stops. They continue, unfolding into consequences that extend far beyond the room. And as he finally stood, one realization followed him out, steady and unavoidable. The question was no longer whether he had made a mistake. It was how far that mistake had reached, and what it would cost to face it fully. The decision came without spectacle. No raised voices, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet shift that carried more weight than anything that had happened before. Weeks had passed since the review, and the process had moved beyond conversations and into conclusions. Officer Daniel Hayes stood in a courtroom that felt colder than the cemetery had ever been, not because of temperature, but because of finality. There were no rows of white headstones here, no flags moving gently in the wind, only polished wood, measured voices, and the steady rhythm of a system designed to examine actions without emotion. Hayes listened as the findings were read, each sentence precise, each word chosen carefully, outlining not just what had occurred, but how it had been understood, how it had been evaluated within a broader context that extended beyond a single moment. There was no need for exaggeration, no need for emphasis, because the weight of the truth did not require it. It stood on its own. Marcus Whitaker was present, seated quietly among others, not at the center, not elevated, just there, as he had always been, composed, observant, grounded in a calm that had never needed recognition to exist. He did not react outwardly as the outcome was delivered, but his presence alone carried a quiet significance, a reminder that this had never been about one man alone. It had been about something larger, something that touched the space between authority and respect, between assumption and reality. Hayes felt the words settle around him, not striking, not overwhelming, but steady, like a current that could not be resisted. The outcome was clear, the consequences defined, and for the first time, there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to explain. Only acceptance of what had been determined. The courtroom remained still, the process moving forward with the same calm precision it had held from the beginning. And yet, within that stillness, something deeper had shifted, because this was not just an ending. It was a reflection, a point where actions met accountability without distortion. Hayes stood there, not as he had stood at the cemetery, not with certainty or control, but with an understanding that had taken time to form, one that could not be undone once it had been seen. Marcus rose quietly when it was time to leave, his movement unhurried, his expression unchanged. He passed through the room without drawing attention, without seeking it, because he never had. And as he walked out into the daylight beyond the courthouse steps, the world continued as it always does, steady, indifferent, yet shaped in small ways by moments like this. Hayes remained for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because leaving meant carrying the full weight of what had been decided. And when he finally turned to go, one truth followed him, clear and unshakable. He had believed power came from the authority he held, but what he faced now revealed something different entirely. Power had never been in the uniform. It had always been in the truth he failed to see until it was too late.